Welcome everyone to topic 12 for research methods, the final topic of this unit, historical research methods. And this week's topic is probably not so much for the historians amongst us, though it could be of use to you, but most of this information you'll already know. It's more though for those of us who want to incorporate historical research into our research. So some methodology for the non-historians who want to think historically about part of their research and incorporate that into it. The reading this week by Galgano is a really useful start to thinking about historical research methods and the aspects of historical research. They begin by defining history as an interpretation of the past based on the weight of available evidence. And it's a really useful and short definition because it is something that we can unpack to look at historical research methods. In particular, the notions of available evidence and its weight, some type of evaluation, if you like, of evidence, as well as the issue of interpretation of that evidence. The primary limitation, according to Galgano et al., is that of historical research is the available evidence, that is, what can be known of the past. This comes to us in two main ways as in terms of thinking historically in our research. One, a set of sources are the primary sources, the other are the secondary sources. The primary sources of those documents and accounts which are, and let's broaden that out to other objects which may not be intended as primary sources, buildings, books, perhaps letters, a range of things which can be used as primary sources, but these are things that are contemporaneous with the event or issue or theme that's under examination or review. So we're used to those things that are often collected in archives, but they may be elsewhere as well. You might go to, for example, cemeteries to look at headstones. You might look at buildings. You could look at artworks, photographs, as well as written sources. And I guess you could also include oral history as part of your primary source material. I guess in that sense, these oral histories are of memories of experiences that are contemporaneous with the event, but not necessarily contemporary as in a record, as in a journal or letters or that type of source. So each of these sources has its own issues. Secondary sources are historical accounts relying on primary evidence. So these are typically accounts of events that aren't contemporaneous with the event. So we're familiar with these. These are textbooks, monographs, historical surveys, that type of secondary source which gathers together, draws on primary sources to create history and a telling of history. So moving now to this idea of the weight of available evidence. In this sense, I guess weight is weighing in terms of an evaluation and thinking about a range of issues that we might like to consider here are such things as who created the source? Who created this evidence? Knowing who it is will give us a sense of the position from which the source was created. A man, a woman, the class, the position in a government, all those sorts of issues that might give us some clues as to how we consider a piece of evidence. What type of document are we looking at? from what was it produced? What was gathered together to create this document? What sort of information, and where did that information come from? Where was it made? Was it made close by, or was it a newspaper account from far away? When was it made? How soon after the event or the time period we're interested in? And why was it made? What can we infer from the source itself about the motivations for making a particular source? And that might give us some insight into the purpose of the actual account itself, who it was for, and those types of issues. And through thinking about this, we're considering whether a source is, how credible a source is, whether we can trust it, how much trust we can put in it, and how we might go about interpreting it. Thinking in terms of the source in as far as its main point or the points it's making, what underlying assumptions might be embedded in the source itself. Thinking about whether the points of view of the creator and the institution in which it's created and for which it's created. Thinking in terms of argument and logic and in relation to other sources that we know of in particular, and drawing some conclusions around all of these things. So for primary sources, we're not just taking them and thinking of them as true accounts just because they were made at the time, at the place, by somebody who experienced it, but thinking about all the external factors that go into making a source and what gives that account its weight. The other aspect of Galgano's definition of history was the interpretation of the past. And I thought I'd just mention here something from previous weeks around paradigms, because in talking about interpretation, I guess it makes us think, brings to mind ideas of worldview, and how we might approach history as a discipline. One end of the spectrum of approaching history might be a positivist approach, that is, history as a science of fact about events, happenings, occurrences, numbers, outcomes, those sorts of things which are beyond dispute. So history in this sense would be a series of facts beyond dispute about the past through historical documents, primary sources, writing about the factual nature of the past. On the other end of the spectrum, I guess, is a historicist approach, which understands that history is a complex subject. The history of our societies is complex. Our societies themselves are complex. And there can be no one absolutely correct view for all time on historical research and history. History in this sense is always moving and being reinterpreted. You might say this is more of an interpretivist approach to history in that paradigm sense. Both of these approaches to history, and they're on a spectrum, people will be to varying degrees along a spectrum between these, will take into account a range of things. And one of the things which is common as in terms of history is taking into account in our interpretation of the past, in our interpretation of primary sources and synthesizing them together, putting together a story from them as well as what we know of from secondary sources, is historical context. That understanding the time itself and its codes, its cultural codes, its the ways of life that go together to create that historical time, this context is very important in interpretation and in understanding documents. What we're doing in this sense is avoiding presentism, that is, of avoiding an interpretation of documents based on our understanding of how those documents might function now. So it's very much about putting ourselves into the milieu, into the cultural flow of the time, of understanding that context in order to create history and to interpret the past. The second thing we might think of, and this coincides more with the historicist approach clearly than the positivist approach, is points of view. The point of view of the historian in constructing history, and of being aware of how our point of view will affect our reading of the past, our interpretation of the past, and how we might take that into account as we're constructing ideas of the past. So, in that sense, we're interpreting the past reflexively, taking ourselves into account, our biases, our prejudices, our leanings, the things that we don't see as much as we can, as well as historical context, into account when we make our interpretations. From all that, we might draw this together by saying that there might be three main aspects of a historical methodology, drawing on the work of Gilbert Garrigan from back in the 1940s. Three aspects, the first being heuristic, that is a hands-on or interactive approach to searching for information, and it's going to be interactive in that its sources are going to be found. It may lead us to think about other sources we wish to find, other repositories where we might find things, other forms of evidence we might draw on, photographs, books, images, paintings, buildings, and a search for material from which we're going to make our knowledge, including, of course, some secondary sources for understanding context, and developing our material there. Some appraisal of that material, especially for your argument, so some criticism, a critical phase here. We're putting things together in order to construct something, but in the meantime also thinking about the weight of those sources and how much we can trust them and put and emphasize them in our research and in telling the story that we're after. And then, I guess, a synthesis and exposition, that is drawing all that together into a story, our telling about the past, putting together an argument, understanding the significance of that argument in terms of existing knowledge of this particular period. So that's a broad, I guess, brush approach to an historical methodology. What all this draws us to is an understanding that all histories are interpretations. And I thought it would be interesting just to think about the way that history changes just by focusing on two books. One quite recent, Dark Emu by Bruce Pascoe, is a rereading of explorers' narratives and journals. So thinking in Australian history of those explorations, Burke and Wills, Mitchell, Leichhardt, people of that type who did all that exploration around Australia in that early colonisation, period of colonisation, and the way that those journals and writings can be used. Now, they have been used initially to tell the story of progress of the nation in that sort of nationalist sense of development, of a story of progress, of Australian nationhood and identity. Bruce Pascoe, as an Indigenous researcher and historian, has read those books, those journals, these primary sources, in a different way, looking for new things. In particular, what he did was to read for accounts of existing Aboriginal culture. And through those readings of those primary sources, taking a new point of view from an Aboriginal perspective, re-evaluating the accounts, seeing new things in them, has put together a book that argues for, and so I guess this is the point of significance for Bruce Pascoe in his book, arguing for a Aboriginal culture that was encountered by these explorers, that was one that incorporated agriculture, settlements and villages, a range of cultural practices which have gone unnoticed before. And so through this, Bruce Pascoe is arguing for a understanding of Aboriginal culture as agricultural, turning a lot of the discourse around Aboriginal culture as nomadic, hunter-gatherer, of not improving the land, so putting that in inverted commas, but that narrative that goes with the construct of terra nullius, putting all of that into question. And so this is a really good example of how the same source can be used and reinterpreted because of someone's point of view, a historian's point of view, who is looking afresh at these sources. The next next book I was thinking about in this regard I was thinking about in a different way. This is Kenneth Clark's Landscape into Art. So this is a book of art history, telling the story of Western art, Western landscape art, in particular European landscape art, written in the 1940s. The reason I thought I'd just mention this book is because his interpretation of landscape art is predicated on his knowledge of European landscape painting. Written in 1940, his sources, the artworks he has access to, were those which he could either see in photographs, which was limited to black and white, or paintings that he had actually seen, taken notes about and remembered, and as well as existing scholarship also, obviously. But what that means is, unlike today's historians of art, there's no looking on the internet at artworks, but there's travel from place to place, which necessarily limits the range of available evidence to Kenneth Clark in his interpretation of the history of landscape painting. Now, I'm not making any arguments here about the deficiencies or otherwise of his work. It's a landmark book, but nevertheless, I guess what I wanted to note here is that this history has its own limits in terms of the evidence that Kenneth Clark could draw upon. And so therefore, this interpretation of landscape art opens itself to new interpretations when further evidence is gathered. So there's a whole range of things in this book that I guess we can see lends itself to thinking about how we can read history and think about this, for example, as a source, as a primary source. It's a secondary source, but it could play a part as a primary source as well in a study of how history has been constructed. In talking about that, then, what we're starting to deal with is historiography. That is the way history has been and is written. Both these books, Dark Emu and Landscape into Art, could be the subject of historiography. And we're thinking here about the changing interpretations of events in the works of historians. One of the things that comes to mind for me as I talk about this is history is always history as it is for us. And what I like about this is that it reminds us that history is always being currently reimagined, reinterpreted, retold, whether because we've got new evidence or because we think differently about the sources at hand. It's about what is important to us in our particular time. As we come to sources and to primary sources, and even as we read secondary sources, because of our cultural and historical time, different things will be important to us. We will be seeking different answers from this history, different lessons from these works, and from primary sources. And so, in this sense, history is always for us, because it's about what we need from our history almost. What is it that we take from it, and what does it do for us now in terms of current cultural questions, problems, issues, and so on. So that's a very quick exploration through historical research. So I'd encourage you to have a look at the study guide, look at the readings, start thinking about history and what it means to think historically. If you're incorporating history into your research, think about the methods, think about your methodology as you do that, and how you're thinking about your sources and where you're finding those sources. Okay, well, that's probably enough about history. All the best. And I won't say see you next time. This is the last topic for research methods. Okay, see you later. Bye-bye.